Harold M. Landry didn't wear a uniform anymore, but if you looked closely, you could still see the man who once did. There was something in the way he carried himself, shoulders just barely stooped, yet somehow still squared, hands calloused and steady, even in old age. That morning, as he stepped into the Tacoma branch of First Pioneer Bank, all he wore was a light windbreaker, dark slacks, and a well-loved cap that read, "Desert Storm Veteran." Faded gold thread. A quiet declaration. He wasn't there to draw attention, didn't need help, didn't come to start a scene. All he wanted was to withdraw a few $100s from an account he hadn't touched in nearly 2 decades. The money was meant for one thing, a new bike for his great-grandson Emmett, whose father had passed away 6 months earlier in a logging accident. Harold had promised the boy, and a promise to a man like Harold meant more than just words. The inside of the bank was quiet, almost sterile. White tile floors, soft jazz on the speakers, a line of tired eyes waiting behind glass partitions. Harold walked in like anyone else, nodding politely to the security guard near the entrance. No one paid him much attention, except for one young teller Tricia, who glanced briefly at his cap, then back down at her screen. He waited patiently in line, as he always had. Time, after all, had taught him patience. When it was his turn, he stepped up and gently placed his ID on the counter. "I'd like to make a small withdrawal, ma'am," he said, his voice gravelly but calm. "Account under Harold M. Landry. Been a while since I touched it." Tricia blinked at the name, typed a few keys, then frowned. "This account hasn't had activity since 2007, she said, looking uncertain. "And the documents you're using to verify, well, they're really old. Is this discharge form original?" Harold nodded slowly. "It is. Dated 1992. After my last operation." She hesitated. "I'm going to have to call my manager." Harold didn't argue. He just stood there, hands clasped in front of him, waiting again. Within moments, a man in his mid-30s appeared behind the counter, clean-cut, sharply dressed, the kind of guy who looked like he practiced his smirk in the mirror. "Trent Myers," he said, extending a hand, though not really offering it. "Branch manager." He picked up Harold's documents, flipping through them with exaggerated disbelief. "Sir, these look like they were typed on a typewriter." "That's because they were," Harold replied, still calm. Trent chuckled, clearly not amused. "Look, we take fraud seriously. We've had people try to fake veteran status before. Buy medals online, create fake DD-214s, try to guilt people into letting them slide. I'm not here for pity," Harold said, "just here to keep a promise." That's when he reached into his jacket and laid a small object on the counter. A coin, thick, brass, finely etched, with the emblem of the United States Central Command and a hawk in mid-dive. Samantha Cho, standing near the back of the lobby, narrowed her eyes. She knew that coin, had only seen one like it once, at a classified briefing in Baghdad, but Trent didn't flinch. "Cute trinket," he muttered. "You know they sell replicas on Etsy now, right?" He waved toward the guard. "I think we've got another one. Escort him out." The guard looked unsure, but slowly stepped forward. Harold didn't resist. He simply retrieved the coin, folded the discharge paper, and placed them both back into his coat. With the same quiet dignity he entered with, he turned and walked to a nearby bench, and sat. Not a word, not a complaint. The bank grew still. Not silent from guilt, not yet, but something colder. That uncomfortable hush that slips in when people aren't quite sure they did the right thing. Samantha stepped forward. "That man isn't a fake," she said clearly. "That coin alone outranks every bank account in this room." Trent scoffed. "If he's so important, why is he here alone?" Samantha didn't answer. She simply turned, walked outside, and pulled out her phone. She made the call, but she wasn't the only one who had noticed something strange. In the back office, an older maintenance man named Mickey had been listening. He'd heard the name, Harold M. Landry. It struck something familiar. He stood, walked slowly to the back hallway, and wiped away the dust from a brass dedication plaque mounted on the wall. It had been there since the bank opened in the early 2000s. In recognition of those who secured and designed this land, including Lieutenant Colonel Harold Landry, United States Army. The same man they were now accusing of faking his identity. Mickey didn't waste time. He picked up an old landline phone and dialed a number only a handful of people still remembered. When the voice on the other end answered, Mickey said just 4 words: Landry, veteran, denied bank. Then he hung up. Back on the bench, Harold sat quietly, hands folded over his cane. He didn't know what was coming. He hadn't asked for help. He hadn't expected the world to stand still, but it was already starting to shift. Time inside a bank moves slowly when you're being watched. When every glance feels like a judgment and every breath echoes louder than it should. Harold M. Landry sat on that bench near the window like a man waiting for a bus that might never come. Not fidgeting, not slouched. Just still, like he'd done this before because he had. That same posture had held under enemy fire, in boardrooms filled with brass, in aircraft hangars at midnight when plans were rewritten in the dark. Harold had waited before, for orders, for comrades, for answers, and now he waited again, not for medals or forgiveness, but because some men don't walk out. Not when something's been broken, not when their name is on the line. Across the lobby, the air shifted. The joking was gone. The whispers, too. People were uneasy now, not because they knew what had happened, but because they sensed what might have happened. The security guard who had been motioned toward Harold now stood uncertain, lingering near the entrance. He wasn't sure what to do anymore. But the old man's quiet was louder than any shout. Trent Myers, meanwhile, was getting agitated. He paced behind the teller line, arms crossed, eyes flicking toward the front doors every few seconds. He didn't like silence, especially the kind you couldn't control. So he tried to brush it off. "He's still here?" he muttered, half to himself. A junior employee nodded silently. He's probably waiting for someone to post about it. Get a viral video going. These guys do that all the time. Play the vet card, hope for pity donations. Even Tricia, the young teller, didn't laugh this time. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard, unmoving. Samantha Cho had come back inside and was now standing across the lobby, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Harold. She'd placed the call, to a man she hadn't spoken to in over a year. Her old CO, retired now, but still connected. "I need you to trust me," she had said on the phone. "The man sitting in this lobby, he's not just anyone. His name is Harold M. Landry." There had been silence on the line. Then a breath. "Don't let him leave," the voice had replied. "We're already on it." And they were. 3 miles away, a convoy vehicle had veered across traffic. Black SUV, no markings, military-grade suspension. It cut through Tacoma like a quiet storm. Inside sat General Deborah McIntyre, full 4-star general, decorated, with 36 years of service, current deputy commander for continental operations. She was not in the mood to be delayed. When her aide had passed the message and she'd heard the name Harold Landry, she stopped mid-sentence in the middle of a logistics briefing and said just 3 words: "Get the car." No questions, no notes, no hesitation. Back in the bank, Harold shifted slightly on the bench. His back ached. His hands, now resting on the cane, showed signs of old injuries, knuckles slightly misshapen, scars hidden by age. Yet his eyes stayed sharp, focused, watching the flag across the street flap in the wind like it had something to say. Samantha walked over and gently sat beside him. "I just want you to know," she said, "you're not alone in this." Harold gave a faint smile but didn't look at her. "Doesn't matter," he said softly. "Never did it for applause." She nodded. "I didn't think you did, but you deserve to be seen." Harold closed his eyes for a moment. "I don't need to be seen, just needed a little cash to keep a promise, that's all." That promise again, he didn't explain it, didn't say what it was. But you could feel it hanging in the air like the end of a hymn. Back behind the counter, Trent finally lost his cool. "This is ridiculous," he barked. "He's been sitting here like a statue. I should have called the cops an hour ago. He..." Turned to Tricia. "You know what this looks like, right? We're being manipulated, all of us. Some washed-up fake comes in here with a coin and a story." But he didn't get to finish. The doors of First Pioneer Bank flew open, not violently, not recklessly, but with purpose, like authority had just stepped into the room, and it had 4 boots, black, polished, precise, hit the floor in rhythm. Not rushed, not theatrical, just certain. First through the door was General Deborah McIntyre, full dress uniform, silver-grey hair pulled back in military regulation, ribbons across her chest that told stories few civilians would ever know. Behind her was an aide, carrying a steel briefcase. The lobby fell into instant silence. Phones were lowered, coffee cups paused mid-sip. Even Trent, who had just been ranting, was frozen mid-gesture. The smirk on his face evaporated like mist in sunlight. McIntyre didn't say a word at first. She walked straight toward Harold. And in front of everyone, every customer, every employee, every doubter, she snapped to attention and offered the most formal salute a soldier can give. The room held its breath. Harold, confused at first, slowly stood. His movements were deliberate, stiff, yes, but practiced. He returned the salute with quiet grace. It had been decades, but he had not forgotten how. The air inside First Pioneer Bank had shifted, not just the hush of sudden silence, not just the tension of embarrassment. No, this was something else entirely. This was reverence, something old, something powerful, the kind of presence that didn't need introduction. General Deborah McIntyre lowered her hand after the salute and let a pause stretch out, long enough to make every person in the room squirm, even the ones who didn't know why. Harold Landry, still standing, tilted his head slightly and gave a small nod. "General," he said quietly. "Colonel?" McIntyre replied, using the rank with full intention. At the word colonel, a few gasps rippled across the room. Tricia at the teller window looked like someone had pulled the ground out from under her. One customer near the waiting chairs slowly set their coffee down without breaking eye contact. Even the security guard straightened his posture, suddenly unsure of his role in the room. McIntyre turned to face the room. Her voice was low, but every syllable landed like the strike of a gavel. "Who here," she asked, "called Colonel Harold?" "Monsieur Landry a fraud." No one spoke, not at first. Trent shifted uncomfortably. His mouth opened, then closed again. The heat crept into his face, turning his neck red. I didn't know," he stammered. "Of course you didn't know," McIntyre cut in sharply. "Because you didn't ask, you didn't research, you didn't respect. You looked at an old man and assumed his story was fake because his paperwork wasn't printed yesterday." She stepped closer. "Colonel Landry served in 3 theaters. He helped coordinate logistical airlifts in Desert Storm under blackout conditions. He co-authored reconnaissance procedures we still use today. He bled for this country while you were learning how to log into Wi-Fi." Every word was a hammer. His coin, the one you mocked, is not a replica. It was hand-presented by the CENTCOM commanding officer during Operation Copper Eagle. That coin, Mr. Myers, is rarer than your entire resume. The room was silent. Trent looked like he might pass out. McIntyre turned to her aide and gave a subtle nod. The young officer stepped forward, opened the steel briefcase, and placed 3 items on the counter in front of Tricia. A velvet box holding a military commendation medal that had been filed but never delivered. A certified duplicate of Landry's original commendation dossier marked with Pentagon seals and signatures. A scan of a brass dedication plaque, the very one hanging in the back office with Harold M. Landry's name engraved in bold letters as a founding contributor to the infrastructure project the bank was built upon. "This building," McIntyre continued, "sits on land that was once part of the Strategic Border Reinforcement Initiative Colonel Landry led. The very supply chain this bank now profits from began as a military-grade logistics system, drafted by him. No one said a word. Even the HVAC system seemed to hum more quietly. McIntyre turned back to Harold. Her tone softened. "Sir, we didn't know you were back in town. I apologize. Not on behalf of the army, but as a human being. You should have never been questioned. Not here, not like this." Harold gave a small nod. "Didn't come to be found. Just needed enough to help my great-grandson. He's got a birthday coming and I promised him a new bike." A silence fell again, the kind that clings to the walls, thick and reverent. McIntyre glanced toward the counter. "Then let's make that happen." As she moved to assist him, Trent finally found his voice, barely. I didn't mean harm. It's just With all the scams. McIntyre turned slowly. This man survived 2 deployments, 3 bombings, and more betrayals than you could imagine. But do you know what broke him today? It wasn't bullets or war, it was being laughed at by people too young to know better and too arrogant to ask. Trent didn't answer. He simply stepped back, hands raised slightly in retreat, as McIntyre and Harold moved to the counter. Trisha's hands shook as she processed the transaction. She couldn't even make eye contact. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Harold didn't reply, not out of spite. Just because he didn't need to. He took the printed receipt, folded it once and tucked it into his coat pocket, like it was nothing more than another duty fulfilled. But before he turned to leave, McIntyre placed a hand on his shoulder. "Colonel," she said gently, "you've got 5 minutes." Harold raised a brow. 5 minutes for what? McIntyre tilted her head toward the lobby. "For the honor you never asked for." Then, without a single command, something remarkable happened. Every veteran in the bank, us, from a young reservist by the ATM to an old Navy corpsman by the deposit slips, stood, straight tall, and they saluted. No one told the civilians what to do, but they stood too, one by one, out of respect, out of shame, out of something ancient and true that lived deep in the bones. Harold stood frozen for a moment, not in pride, but in disbelief. Then, slowly, he lifted his hand and returned the salute. Harold's hand stayed steady as he returned the salute. For a man who hadn't worn his uniform in nearly 3 decades, the motion still carried the exact precision of protocol, but none of the pomp. It was quiet, controlled, like muscle memory stitched into the very bones of who he was. Then he let it drop gently to his side as the room remained standing. No one moved. No one reached for their phones. No one dared to speak first. It wasn't a ceremony. It wasn't even official. It was something deeper. It was recognition from people who understood that sometimes the most honorable thing a soldier can do is nothing at all. To endure, to show up, to stay quiet, even when the world forgets. General McIntyre reached once more into her coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "This was meant to be delivered to your home in 2005, she said. "But after the task force you led was dissolved and your records were sealed, the citation got buried. Someone filed it under non-priority pending review, bureaucracy mostly, but we kept it." She held out the box. Inside was a shimmering silver medal, clean and untouched, engraved with just 4 words, "Service Beyond Record, HML." Harold didn't reach for it right away. He stared at it a long time, his expression unreadable. Not surprised, not emotional, just still, like a man studying the shape of something he never thought he'd see again. "I don't need medals," he said quietly. "I know," McIntyre replied, "but this one needs you." It was the kind of exchange that didn't need a crowd. It would have meant the same in a hallway, in a back room, or a battlefield. But here, surrounded by civilians, younger employees, veterans, and strangers who moments ago had laughed, it carried something larger. Redemption. Not for Harold, but for them. He finally reached forward and took the box, held it for a moment, then closed it with a soft snap, as if sealing a chapter of his life for good. He turned back toward the counter, where Trisha still stood with eyes glistening. She whispered, "Would you like a printed balance, sir?" Harold offered a gentle smile. "No need. I only came for what I promised." He tucked the receipt into his coat and stepped back. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just Harold, a grandfather trying to keep his word. As he walked toward the door, the crowd parted like water. Some nodded, a few placed hands over their hearts. No one dared to meet his gaze directly. It was too much, too real. But General McIntyre wasn't done. She turned to the room, not to scold, but to offer something honest. "You may not have known his name when he walked in," she said, "but after today you'll remember it every time you cash a check, make a transfer, or open a savings account. Because without the logistics systems Colonel Landry built, most of the technology your bank runs on wouldn't even exist." She looked directly at Trent Myers, who stood red-faced, stiff and defeated near the back wall. "Respect," she said, doesn't come from knowing everything. It comes from being willing to listen before you judge. Learn that, or get out of the way for those who have. No rebuttal came, no one argued, no one challenged. She turned to Harold one last time. "You sure you don't want to stay for the official recognition?" Harold shook his head. "Never needed a podium, I just needed a bike." They both laughed. Just a small private thing between two people who understood the absurdity of honor arriving late, but still arriving. As Harold reached the doors, McIntyre stepped beside him. "Mind if I walk you out?" Harold raised an eyebrow. "I thought generals had better things to do." She smiled. "Not today." The doors opened. Sunlight spilled into the lobby, casting long shadows behind them as they walked out together. No news crews. No headlines, just silence and footsteps. But inside that bank, something had changed. People moved a little slower. Voices dropped a little softer. Even Trent, who once sneered with such certainty, now stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at the floor like a student who'd just been given a history lesson, one that came with consequences. And then, one final detail. Later that week, just before the bank opened for the day, Mickey the maintenance man took out a fresh brass plate. He mounted it just below the original dedication plaque in the back hallway. It read La Collis, Harold M. Landry, U.S. Army, quiet valor, unshakable integrity. There was no photo, no explanation, but everyone at First Pioneer Bank knew the story. They didn't need to say it out loud, because some truths don't require volume to be heard. In the days that followed, the bank returned to its usual rhythm. The soft hum of printers, the quiet shuffle of paperwork, the sterile scent of air conditioning and weak coffee. But something invisible lingered. It clung to the floor tiles, it sat heavy on the backs of chairs. It whispered through hallways every time someone glanced at the door and half expected to see him again. Harold M. Landry didn't come back. He hadn't intended to in the first place. He had what he came for, a small withdrawal to keep a promise to a little boy named Emmett, who would soon be riding down a suburban street on a new red bicycle, streamers flowing, unaware that it had taken a general, a coin, and a long-forgotten plaque to make it happen. But for those left behind in that lobby, the tellers, the manager, the customers, even the security guard, Harold's silence had said more than any speech ever could. It had spoken of a different kind of service, one that didn't need fanfare, one that didn't seek acknowledgement, one that simply endured, year after year, long after the uniforms were folded and the medals packed away in drawers. Samantha Cho, the former Air Force specialist who had stood up when no one else would, found herself reflecting on that day every time she entered a government building. She started keeping her old challenge coin in her purse again, not as a weapon, not as proof, but as a quiet reminder that you never know who you're standing next to. Tricia, the young teller, had asked for a transfer to the bank's records department. She told her supervisor she wanted to better understand the documents veterans bring in, how to read discharge papers, how to recognize military honors, how to avoid another moment of shame. Even Trent Myers changed. Not right away. Not dramatically. But something cracked in him that day. Something rigid and shallow finally gave way. He stopped wearing the smugness like armor. He started listening more, slowed down. The next time a gray-haired man stepped into his bank wearing a dusty cap and holding weathered papers, Trent offered him a chair before anything else. The story of what happened that Thursday morning spread quietly through Tacoma. There was no news headline, no viral clip, no camera footage, but the truth has a way of moving without being pushed, and sometimes the most meaningful stories, the ones that truly stick, are the ones passed from person to person, spoken in lowered voices across dinner tables or quietly, relayed at the end of church services. You hear about the old vet at the bank last week, the one the general showed up for? Yeah, said he helped build the place back when it was still military land. Didn't say a word when they laughed at him, just sat there, waited like he already knew. In a way he did, because men like Harold M. Landry know the weight of silence. They've carried it through war zones, through airports where no one says welcome home, through VA waiting rooms that forget names as quickly as they call them. And yet, they keep showing up. Not for glory, but for promises. A week later, Emmett received his bike. The receipt, folded once and tucked into a jacket pocket, never left Harold's coat. It remained there, even when the coat was hung neatly, on the back of a chair near his front window. The same window where he watched birds every morning with his coffee, quiet and steady. He didn't tell Emmett how hard it had been to get the money. He didn't talk about the general or the coin or the strangers who had stood to salute. He just watched the boy ride, free and laughing, because that was the victory. That was the whole point. Later that month, a handwritten letter arrived at the bank. No return address, just the initials HL. At the bottom it read, "To those who saw me and didn't recognize me, I forgive you. To those who laughed, I understand. To the one who stood, I thank you. I didn't come there for praise. I came because promises matter. And if you remember anything, let it be this. Service doesn't stop at retirement. Sometimes it simply becomes invisible." They framed the letter and placed it just inside the bank entrance, next to the new brass plaque. And from that day on, every person who walked through the doors of First Pioneer Bank passed under the weight of a story they nearly forgot. They didn't laugh anymore, they remembered. And maybe that's all a man like Harold ever wanted. Not a parade, not a medal, not a headline. Just to be remembered, not for what he had done, but for who he still was, a soldier, a grandfather, a man who kept his promises, even when the world stopped keeping count. Some people wear their service on their sleeves. Others carry it quietly, in their hearts. Harold M. Landry was the kind of man who didn't ask for thanks. He just kept his word. His story reminds us of something we often forget in today's fast-paced world. Respect is not given based on appearance, titles, or youth. It's earned through quiet sacrifice and unshakable integrity. We are surrounded by people with stories we don't see. Veterans, elders, the soft-spoken neighbor who walks with a cane. Their silence isn't weakness. It's strength wrapped in humility. So take a moment. Slow down. Listen before you judge. Ask before you assume. And above all, honor those who paved the road you now walk. Because the most powerful legacies aren't always the loudest ones. They're often the ones that simply show up and keep their promises.